Alrighty, chapter 10. Probably should have split this into two parts, so just a heads up, it is going to be kind of a long one. So developmental psychology is the study of how behaviors change over the lifespan. So the first part of the chapter wanted to clarify what exactly the nature versus nurture argument is. I know I've kind of touched on it before, but they go more in depth. So in the mid-90s, Hart and Risley published a now classic study demonstrating that parents who talk to their kids a lot have kids with larger vocabularies than those whose parents didn't speak to them as much. This has been replicated using different populations and measures, so presumably this provides evidence towards the strong environmental influence on children's vocabulary. But since parents and children share environments and genetics, there's a possible genetic influence here as well. So as far as gene-environment interaction, nature and nurture interact across the span of development, meaning the effect of one depends on the contribution of the other. So for example, some studies found that an individual lacking an enzyme monoamine oxidase, or MAO, were slightly more likely to develop into violent criminals. With that being said, not everyone lacking that enzyme will become a violent criminal, and I'm sure there's plenty of violent criminals who had the enzyme and still became violent. Another study found that missing MAO was not enough by itself to cause individuals to become violent. They found that the genetic risk depended on environmental factors as well. More specifically, children with missing MAO and a history of maltreatment, for example, physical abuse, were at a higher risk of developing antisocial behaviors. As far as the actual nature versus nurture debate, nature can impact what kind of environment a child experiences. In particular, kids with certain genetic predispositions often seek out and create their own environments. This is called nature via nurture. In this way, nurture allows kids to express their genetic tendencies. And then we have gene expression. So even though it may sound weird, environmental experiences actually turn genes on and off. I know I discussed this in our biopsych lecture, but this goes a little bit more into it. So gene expression is the activation or deactivation of genes by environmental experiences throughout development. So basically, just because someone has a genetic predisposition to something doesn't mean it will happen. It will likely take a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental factors for the gene to go on or offline. A few examples are anxiety and depression. Individuals may have a genetic predisposition to these disorders, but they may not actually develop these disorders. So one of the more interesting findings regarding this in recent years is the fact that gene expression is in constant fluctuation, meaning a gene can be turned off or on multiple times throughout an individual's lifetime. This is known as epigenetics and has been important in understanding physical and mental health. This reminds us that nurture affects nature, and in turn, nature affects how we react to nurture, and so on. So human development. So early life experiences can, and usually do, shape later development in powerful ways. Early input from the outside world exerts a significant impact on brain development. However, these don't stop after the first few years of development, so we shouldn't overestimate the effect experiences from infancy have on long-term development. While they are influential, they can potentially be reversed later in life. Contrary to some beliefs, children are actually very resilient. While it's obvious early experience does have an impact on a child's physical, cognitive, and social development, there's no reason to believe later experiences have any less of an impact. Most children are also capable of withstanding stress and trauma, emerging from potentially traumatic experiences in surprisingly good shape. This does not mean it won't affect them later in life, though. Traumatic events in childhood can lead to problems in adulthood. Additionally, just because most kids will be mostly okay after a traumatic event doesn't mean they should have to endure one. Don't traumatize kids if you can avoid it. Next, we have cohort effects. So one phenomenon that can really throw a wrench into studies, especially cross-sectional ones, are cohort effects, which are effects observed in a sample of participants that results from individuals in the sample growing up at the same time. For example, older adults today are not as good with computers as younger generations are. Additionally, younger adults typically don't know how to invest or plan for retirement like older adults do. These effects are most prominent in cross-sectional experimental designs, which capture a snapshot of a phenomenon as opposed to observing it over time, which would be done through a longitudinal study. So longitudinal studies can help account for cohort effects. They are typically done with one group of people and follows them over a given amount of time. And this amount of time can be a few months, it can be a few years, it can be decades, however long the experimenter wants it to go. So this also allows us to observe developmental effects, which are changes within individuals as a consequence of getting older. So without longitudinal designs, we may draw faulty conclusions, especially when thinking about developmental research. The major disadvantage to these designs is they are time-consuming and expensive. Not to mention, you typically have to account for people dropping out of the study because that almost always happens. Longitudinal designs definitely have their place in research, but it is important to consider the cost of any experiment before conducting it. Longitudinal designs also tend to use more observational data instead of experimental designs, limiting the conclusions you can draw. Meaning, unless you put a good structure in place, you most likely won't be able to draw causation from a longitudinal study. And just to provide a visual aid, I have this little picture here. So each person, or where the person is in the line, represents their cohort. For example, top baby, bottom baby, same cohort. Top kid, bottom kid, same cohort. Top old man, bottom old lady, same cohort. So, like I said, cohorts just really represent the time in which people grew up or something like that. Next, we have a post hoc fallacy, which is a false assumption that because an event occurred before another event, it must have caused that event. This is where correlation does not equal causation comes into play again. Just because one event happened before another does not mean the relationship is causal. So while temporal precedence does have to occur for causation to occur, it's not enough alone to indicate causation. Meaning, just because A happened before B doesn't mean A caused B, but in order to infer causation, A has to happen before B. Next, we have bidirectional influences. So the development of human behavior is almost always bidirectional, especially in development. So children's experiences influence their development, and their development influences what they experience. So as children grow older, they play an increasing role in selecting their own environments. It's important to keep this in mind because popular culture loves to only use unidirectional explanations. For example, parents fight, so kids react negatively. And using that same example, so bidirectional would mean that kids behaving negatively could lead to parents fighting. So before we begin this section, I just want to preface it by saying I'm going to do my best to keep language here gender neutral, just because there are a lot of nuances in gender identity versus sex and the ability to get pregnant. Additionally, the primary focus here is the stages of development from conception to birth. So during the prenatal stage, pregnancy, the human body acquires its general form and structure. The most dramatic changes during this stage are during the early stages of pregnancy. So first, a sperm cell fertilizes the egg to create a zygote, which is just a fancy word for fertilized egg. And development following that unfolds in 3 stages. So in the germinal stage, the zygote begins to divide and double, forming a blastocyst, which is a ball of identical cells early in pregnancy that haven't yet begun to take on any specific function in a body part. This keeps growing for the first week and a half or so after fertilization. Around the middle of the 2nd week, the cells begin to differentiate, taking on roles as the organs of the body begin to develop. Once cells begin to differentiate, so take on different functions, the blastocyst becomes an embryo. The embryonic stage continues from the 2nd to the 8th week of development, during which limbs, facial features, and major organs begin to take shape. During this stage, many things can go wrong during development. So spontaneous miscarriages often occur when the embryo doesn't form properly, and a lot of the time without the pregnant person even knowing they were pregnant. By the 9th week, the major organs are established and the heart begins to beat. This milestone indicates the fetal stage, in which the embryo becomes a fetus. This phase is more about fleshing out what's already there than it is about developing new structures. So the brain begins to develop 18 days after fertilization. Unlike our other organs, the brain continues to grow into adolescence and probably early adulthood. Between day 18 and month 6 of the pregnancy, neurons begin developing at an astronomical rate, and this process is called proliferation. Some estimates believe the neural growth rate to be around 250,000 brain cells per minute at peak times. This leads to an overproduction of neurons, more than they will need as an infant. The brain also has to organize the cells to perform coordinated functions. So starting in month 4 and continuing throughout pregnancy, migration of cells begins to occur. So neurons begin sorting themselves out and move into their final positions. Now, some obstacles to fetal development. Development can be affected in 4 major ways. We have premature birth, low birth weight, exposure to hazardous environmental influences, and biological influences resulting from genetic disorders or errors in cell duplication or division. So for premature birth, these are infants born at fewer than 36 weeks gestation. The viability point of a pregnancy is around 25 weeks, because this is when an infant is believed to be able to survive on their own outside of the womb. Premature babies can have a whole host of medical, psychological, and cognitive impairments. With each week of the pregnancy, the likelihood of survival increases, and the likelihood of developmental disorders decreases. Most babies born after 32 weeks seem to have minimal long-term consequences. On a related note, if you look at the infographic, diagram, the picture. So notice how at 24 weeks is when the lungs begin to develop. So if baby's born with no lungs, it's kind of a problem. And then if you look at 32 weeks, this is when the bones are developing. So they can fuse bones, they can break them and put them back together if they have to. So this is probably why most pregnancies 32 weeks in later tend to have minimal long-term effects. Because by then, baby is pretty much fully formed, it's just fine-tuning the details. Might be a little small though. Which ties into the next complication, which is low birth weight. So premature babies typically weigh less than full-term babies because they didn't have as long to bulk up. With that being said, some full-term babies can still have low birth weight. Low birth weight is defined as 5.5 pounds or less at birth. So low birth weight increases the risk of death, infection, developmental delays, and even psychological disorders like depression and anxiety. However, the exact extent of this relationship isn't fully known, because low birth weight is typically related to other complications or issues during the pregnancy. Researchers believe low birth weight can be reduced by providing broader access to prenatal education and healthcare. Again, just going back to the picture, if you look at 40 weeks versus 36 weeks versus 32 weeks, you can tell there's a good difference just in the weight there. Say, probably a pound or two. So, as far as hazardous environmental influences, most people don't realize they're pregnant until after the fetus's body and brain development are well underway. So typically, the first indication of a pregnancy is a missed period, which cycles every 28 days, give or take. So it can be up to a month before someone realizes they're pregnant. As a result, some people may unknowingly engage in activities that are potentially harmful to the fetus. So teratogens are environmental factors that can exert a negative impact on prenatal development. These can range from substances like cigarette smoke and alcohol to diseases like chickenpox or hepatitis. Even x-rays can pose a danger to prenatal development. So if someone doesn't know they're pregnant, they have to go in for an x-ray for whatever reason, and they tell the doctor, no, I'm not pregnant. And they get the x-ray, and they are pregnant. Alcohol exposure can lead the fetus to develop fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a condition resulting from high levels of prenatal alcohol exposure, causing learning disabilities, physical growth issues, facial malformations, and behavioral disorders. Those who smoke, cigarettes or otherwise, or use recreational drugs are more likely to have a low birth weight baby. Another teratogen is the mental health of the birth giver on the child's fetal development. Chronic stress has been shown to have adverse effects on prenatal development. Additionally, those on antidepressants have to make a choice on if they're going to stop taking the antidepressant or not when they find out they're pregnant. Typically, they choose to stop taking the medicine. While this lowers the risk of a teratogen being introduced to the fetus from the antidepressants, it puts the fetus in danger in other ways. Typically, pregnant people and their doctors have to decide what will put the fetus in the least amount of danger, and they typically go with that option. As far as genetic disorders, often a cell is copied with some error or break with the genetic material that leads to genetic disorders. And these cells continue to replicate, retain the error, resulting in impaired development of organs or organ systems. This can result in something as minor as a birthmark, or larger issues like intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, and other disorders that prevent blood from, or other disorders like ones that can prevent blood from clotting correctly. Like, I knew a guy, well, he was a teacher when I was in middle school. He legit had nothing from like the elbow down. It was a birth defect. Just this part of his arm didn't form correctly, prenatal. So, infant motor development. So infants are born with a lot of automatic motor behaviors called reflexes that are triggered by certain stimuli. One example is the sucking reflex, an automatic response to having something put in the baby's mouth. Reflexes like this help keep the baby alive. If they couldn't do that, they couldn't eat. So if they had to learn this through trial and error, they'd probably starve. I don't know how many of you have met a baby. Ain't too bright. As far as coordinating movement, reflexes can only go so far. Kids have to learn through trial and error as well, especially with movement. Motor behaviors, which are bodily motions that occur as a result of self-initiated force that moves the bones and muscles, have several major milestones like sitting up, crawling, standing unsupported, and walking. Like with the development of language and reading, the age at which children reach these milestones does vary. As novices at movement, babies haven't yet learned how to perform lightning-quick calculations needed for good coordination and motor planning. Crawling and walking are more complicated than just reaching because it involves supporting the infant's weight, coordinating all four limbs, and keeping track of where the kid is headed. As far as influences on motor development, the different rate at which kids reach a motor milestone suggests that these skills don't necessarily build on each other in a causal fashion, but kids do still go through the motor milestones in the same order. So one of the main factors is the maturation of both the brain and body, because this allows them to become increasingly steady and flexible in their movements. So some motor functions may develop as a consequence of innately programmed patterns of motion that become activated in response to stimuli. Differences in children between the rate at which they reach motor milestones is related to their body weight. So lighter babies reach these milestones quicker than heavier babies. That's probably just because it's easier for legs to move around less weight than it is for more weight. So, makes sense. As with everything else, culture plays a role here, as does parenting. There is a lot of variation between milestones across cultures. For example, in Peru and China, children are tightly swaddled to provide warmth and security, but this limits their mobility as well. For anyone not familiar with swaddling, basically, mom takes baby, wraps it tightly in cloth or blanket, something like that. Makes it easier to A, carry the kid, B, keep track of the kid. So, it's pretty common. Even people in the US do it, but it's not as popular as it is in Peru and China. So, these babies tend to cry less and sleep more soundly, but they also tend to have slightly slower motor development. Another example is people in Africa and West India tend to engage in more stretching, massaging, and strength-building exercises with their infants. Another important factor to consider is growth spurts. So over the course of childhood and adolescence, certain parts of the human body grow and develop at different rates. For example, the head continues to grow, but at a smaller rate than the torso and legs, so adolescents have more proportionate bodies than do babies. Unlike a lot of the other popular psychology we've covered, growth spurts are real. Children and adolescents go through bouts of rapid growth from time to time throughout their development. With that being said, growth still happens between growth spurts, just not as rapidly. Next, we have the physical maturation in adolescence, aka puberty. I'm going to add another little caveat to this section and include the next section as well. When discussing men and women or boys and girls, the text uses a binary sex classification, meaning that they only discuss men and women. They do not address the complications associated with intersex or trans individuals, mostly because not a whole lot of research has been done on them in this domain. To the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, if I am wrong and someone knows I'm wrong, please let me know. Most of the research done on intersex and trans individuals has more to do with their mental state, i.e. depression, anxiety, social support, stuff like that. So, our bodies don't reach full maturity until adolescence, which is the transition between childhood and adulthood most commonly associated with teenage years. A lot of changes that happen during adolescence are hormonal. So the pituitary gland stimulates physical growth, and the reproductive system releases sex hormones into the bloodstream, triggering growth and other physical changes. As we talked about in Chapter 3, both testosterone and estrogen are present in both males and females. In girls, estrogen stimulates the growth of breast, hip widening, and menstruation. Basically, all the things they would need in order to have a kid. In men, testosterone builds muscle strength, increases lung function, and blood circulation. Puberty is a critical component in hormonal development. This is essentially when people can potentially start reproducing. This maturation includes primary sex characteristics, which include the reproductive organs and genitals. It also includes changes in secondary sex characteristics, which are sex-defining characteristics that don't relate directly to reproduction, such as voice deepening. In girls, menarche, I think that's how you say it, which is when they start menstruating, typically won't begin until they've reached full physical maturity. This is nature's way of making sure girls can carry a pregnancy to term and give birth safely, meaning they can give birth without a severe threat to either themselves or the kid. So the timing of puberty is genetically influenced, but a number of environmental factors can play a role here as well. For example, adolescents from higher socioeconomic status households generally have access to better nutrition and healthcare and reach puberty earlier as a result. Girls from richer countries tend to start menstruating earlier than those from poorer countries. On average, the age of menarche has decreased over the past century from about 15 down to about 13, with some girls even beginning sooner. While starting sooner can have some benefits, research has found that girls who begin menstruating at 11 or younger tend to have been exposed to things like abuse, parental neglect, or exposure to community violence earlier in development. Now, this isn't a causal relationship, it's just they so happen to experience this stuff, and they also so happen to begin menstruating earlier. It's not a causal relationship, correlation, not the same as causation. This early menarche can lead to cardiovascular disease and cancer in adulthood. As far as physical development, in adulthood, most people reach their physical peaks in their 20s. As people age, we experience a decline in muscle tone, increase in body fat. Basic sensory processes like hearing and vision begin to decline as well. Even your sense of smell can decrease. Isn't that weird? Like, just, I can see the muscle thing, I can see the fat thing, but the smell, come on. If you're gonna make me fat, at least let me be able to smell the food I'm gonna eat. But I digress. Fertility in women tends to decline sharply over their 30s and 40s, which becomes a problem for those who delay having a child if they choose to have a child. That's a little bit of a rabbit hole. Basically, fertility goes down in 30s and 40s. If you want to have a kid, try to have it before then. If you can't, you might have to get medical intervention. You may not have to, but it's not a guarantee. It's just a heads up. Like, it might happen. Just one of the major milestones for women is menopause. This is when women stop menstruating, marking the end of their reproductive years. This is triggered by a reduction in estrogen, which can result in hot flashes, marked by suddenly becoming hot, sweaty, and dry-mouthed. Menopause is also typically accompanied by mood swings. A common misconception about menopause is that it can lead to increased depression, but research shows that women experiencing menopause are at no higher risk of depression than women not in menopause. One thing I will say though, I lived with my mom when she was going through menopause, and that house was cold. It was like living in a fridge. Like, I get it. I see the reason, but so cold. As far as men, they don't really experience anything similar to menopause. They can actually still reproduce well into old age. Like, I'm talking like 70s, like into old age. While there is a gradual decline in sperm count and testosterone, they can still reproduce with the right medical intervention. I'm sure you guys can probably guess. So, as far as changes in agility and physical coordination, complex tasks show greater effects of age than simpler ones do. Simple motor tasks, such as tapping a finger to a beat, display relatively small declines. So some individuals display greater age-related decreases than others. Strength training and increased physical activity may minimize some of these declines and increase lifespan. Many of the changes we typically associate with aging are not due purely to aging itself, but to diseases that correlate with age, like heart disease and arthritis. So, cognitive development is a study of how children acquire the ability to learn, think, reason, communicate, and remember. It also encompasses adolescents and adults. So, there are a few different theories of cognitive development. There have been a lot, just a lot. But we're really only going to cover two. And these theories tend to differ in three major ways. So, first, some propose stage-like changes in understanding, so sudden spurts in knowledge followed by periods of stability. Others propose more continuous, gradual, incremental changes in understanding. Second, some adopt a domain general account of development, whereas others propose a more domain-specific account. So domain general accounts propose that changes in children's cognitive skills affect most or all areas of cognitive function in parallel. So just change across the board, all of them. Whereas domain-specific accounts propose that children's cognitive skills develop independently and at different rates across different domains, like reasoning, language, counting, all that fun stuff. Third, they differ in their view of the main source of learning. Some models emphasize physical experience, so moving around the world, experiencing the world, whereas others propose social interaction, so how we interact with people, how we learn social norms, stuff like that. And others propose biological maturation, so we just innately know all of this stuff. So yeah, it's innate programming of certain mental capacities. Not all, some. Like reasoning, decision-making, that stuff. So first we're going to talk about Piaget. So Piaget was the first to present a comprehensive account of cognitive development. He attempted to identify the stages that children pass through on their way to adult-like thinking. This led to the formation of cognitive development as a distinct discipline. Maybe his greatest contribution was his insight that children aren't miniature adults. While a lot of people tend to believe this, it's just simply not true. Technically, yes. Developmentally, no. He showed that children's understanding of the world differs fundamentally from adults, but is perfectly rational given their limited experience. So, he was a stage theorist, meaning that he proposed the development is marked by radical reorganization of thinking at specific transition points, followed by periods during which their understanding solidifies. So Piaget proposed that cognitive change is a result of children's need to achieve equilibrium, which he defined as maintaining balance between their experience of the world and their understanding of it. He argued that children are motivated to match their thinking about reality with their observations. So, when a kid experiences something new, they check if the experience fits with their understanding of how the world works. If this is inconsistent, something's got to give. So he focused on two main processes, assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is the process of absorbing new experience into current knowledge structures. Kids use assimilation to acquire and integrate new knowledge within a stage. During said stage, kids' cognitive skills and worldviews remain unchanged. This can only go on for so long. Eventually, kids can no longer reconcile what they believe with what they experience. Accommodation is the process of altering a belief to make it more compatible with experience. This stage forces the kid to look at the world in a new way. If assimilation and accommodation work in tandem, it helps establish a state of harmony between the world and the mind of the child, resulting in equilibrium. So, before we get into the pros and cons, I just want to kind of give you the basics of Piaget's theory. So he believed there were 4 main stages. There was sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So sensory motor is typically between birth and 2 years old. And this is, what happens here is coordination of senses with motor responses, sensory curiosity about the world. Language used for demands and cataloging, and object permanence is developed. So for anyone unfamiliar, object permanence is basically just you can sit something down, walk away from it, and you know it's still there. Or think of the game of peekaboo that people often play with infants. The reason it works is kids, especially young kids, don't have object permanence. So when you put your hands up in front of your face, in their brain, you're gone. Like, you are no longer there. They can't see your face, so you're not there. That's object permanence. The next stage is pre-operational. Typically, this occurs between 2 and 7. What happens here is symbolic thinking, use of proper syntax and grammar to express concepts. Imagination and intuition are strong, but complex abstract thoughts are still difficult, and conversation is developed. So, I don't know if any of you have ever, well, I'm assuming most of you have, but to recall, think of the last time you talked to a kid between 2 and 7 and you asked them an abstract question, and just remember how well that went. I remember when my brother, who's 7 years younger than me, if you told him, like, well, you know, what if this abstract thing happened? He would give a very literal answer, because kids in that age have a very hard time with abstract thinking. Next, we have concrete operational. This is between 7 and 11. What happens here is concepts attached to concrete situations. Time, space, and quantity are understood and can be applied, but not as independent concepts. And lastly, there is the formal operational, so those 11 and older. Theoretical, hypothetical, and counterfactual thinking develop here. Abstract logic and reasoning, strategy and planning become possible. Concepts learned in one context can be applied to another. Now, as far as pros and cons, so Piaget's theory was a significant landmark in cognitive development psychology. Even if it isn't 100% true, it helped push the field forward in a way that may not have happened without it. Now, one of the biggest issues with his theory is that it somewhat lacked replicability, and some of the ideas may have been culturally biased. His theory is believed to be culturally biased because his methodologies elicited more complex responses from kids in weird populations than those from non-weird populations. And just reminder, weird being the acronym, Western, educated, industrialized, R, and democratic. I never remember the R. And because of Piaget, modern psychology has reconceptualized cognitive development by viewing kids as different in kind rather than degree from adults. Also characterizing learning as an active rather than passive process, exploring general cognitive processes that may cut across multiple domains of knowledge, thereby accounting for cognitive development in terms of fewer/more parsimonious underlying processes. The other main theory we're going to discuss is Vygotsky's. So Vygotsky was especially interested in how social and cultural factors influence learning. He noted that parents and caretakers tend to structure the learning environment for children in ways that guide them to behave as if they've learned something before they actually have. This is called scaffolding, which is where parents provide initial assistance in kids' learning, but gradually remove structure as kids become more competent. One of Vygotsky's most famous principles was developmental readiness for learning. He identified the zone for proximal development, which is the phase of learning during which children can benefit from instruction. He suggested that for any given reason, kids can move from a phase when they can't learn it, even with assistance, to the zone of proximal development, during which they're ready to make use of scaffolding. To Vygotsky, he believed kids could eventually learn how to independently perform a task, but they require some guidance when getting started. While Piaget emphasized interaction with the world, Vygotsky emphasized social interaction. That's not right. Vygotsky definitely emphasized social interaction. Piaget's was more like innate processes happening within the kid. I apologize for that mix-up. So, while both of these were very influential theories, modern theories are more diverse, but we can still find their roots in Piaget and Vygotsky. So first we have the general cognitive approach. So modern theorists share Piaget's commitment to general cognitive processes and experience-based learning. But they differ from Piaget in that they regard learning as gradual rather than stage-like. So it's more on a continuum as opposed to a stair-step approach. It's more like, not like up and then over and then up. Next we have sociocultural accounts. These theorists emphasize the social context and ways in which social interaction with caretakers and other children guide children's understanding of the world. Then we also have modular accounts. So similar to Vygotsky's theory, these theorists emphasize the idea of domain-specific learning in the separate spheres of knowledge. So different domains develop at different rates. It's not all just across the board in complete parallel. So now that we've kind of gone over the background of cognitive development, it's time to get into a little bit more of the specifics. So first we have physical reasoning. So to understand their world, kids have to learn to reason about it and around the world. So kids need to learn that some things are solid and fall when dropped. And they hurt themselves when they run into things, stuff like that. You can also see this if your cat's a gremlin, like mine, and loves breaking fragile things to make them fall off counters. But I digress. So Piaget proposed that kids in the sensory motor stage don't have object permanence, meaning when the kid is not looking at the object, it disappears. One major barrier to learning how to reason about the physical world is that children experience some interference from what sometimes has been called naive or folk psychology, much of which derives from our common sense about how the world works. For example, kids often fail to map the trajectory of a moving object, which is why if you're ever playing catch with a kid or something, they throw it excessively hard. Like, no need for all that, Scooter. Simmer down. Folk psychology can interfere with our reasoning about physical objects in other ways, too. For example, kids often suggest that the sky exists, or that clouds exist, for the purpose of making it rain, or that trees provide homes for birds. Next, we have concepts and categories. So one of the most fundamental accomplishments is learning how to categorize objects by kind. So kids learn to recognize dogs, even though dogs come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. Categorization is a critical skill because it frees us from having to explore every object to find out what it is and what it does. Over the course of development, conceptual knowledge becomes richer, more detailed, and more flexible. Kids learn how objects are thematically related to each other. They also learn more about aspects of categories that explain how members of categories connect. This increased conceptual knowledge about categories assists them in reasoning about the world. As far as a sense of self, so developing a sense of self and being distinct from others is critical for kids' development. Their ability to understand themselves as possessing unique identities mostly develops during the toddler and preschool years. As early as their first birthday, kids can recognize their images in a mirror. By 2 years old, they can recognize pictures of themselves and refer to themselves by name. These seem to be tied to development in a specific brain function, namely the junction of the left temporal and parietal lobes. A further development is when kids learn that their view can be different from that of others. So, theory of mind is the ability to reason about what other people know or believe. This is part of the reason young kids look to their parents and those around them to answer questions they have. Sure, we've all met a kid in the why phase. It's like arguing with the world's smallest philosopher. A classic test of theory of mind is the false belief task, which evaluates kids' ability to understand that someone else believes something that they know to be wrong. For example, a kid overhears a conversation saying that someone has stored a treat in a specific place, but a third party, unbeknownst to the kid, has moved the treat. So when the kid goes to look for it, the treat isn't there. Kids typically don't succeed on this task until about 4 or 5. Now we have numbers and math, so basically what counts? Counting and math are both relatively recent developments in humans. We developed the first counting system only a few thousand years ago. Like reading, counting does not naturally develop, but it can be taught. Learning to count can be more complex than you might think. So while a lot of kids can count to 10 at a pretty early age, they also must learn a variety of more complex aspects of numbers, such as that numbers are about amount, number words refer to specific quantities, numbers are ordered from smallest to largest. Next, we have changes in adolescence. So as Piaget noted, we don't develop our most abstract level of reasoning until adolescence. Part of the reason for this is brain development. Another part is about types and complexities of problems we experience for the first time in adolescence. So, while most brain maturation occurs prenatally and in the first few years of life, the frontal lobe does not fully develop until adolescence or early adulthood. Some estimates put the age of reaching full development around 25. So recall from chapter 3 that the frontal lobes are responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control. This is why teenagers, I cannot talk tonight, are often seen as irrational or having a death wish by older adults. They haven't fully developed the ability to repress impulsivity or make what people consider to be rational decisions. Additionally, the limbic system, so the hippocampus, amygdala, and related structures, involved in social rewards become more active, making teens more susceptible to peer pressure, which could increase their risk-taking. Additionally, there are some areas that become more connected during adolescence, whereas others become more functionally independent. Both of these changes have an impact on adolescents' behavior, including learning, motivation, motor coordination, and inhibitory control. Adolescents regularly encounter opportunities to engage in potentially dangerous activities, even though their brains aren't ready to make well-reasoned decisions. However, there is debate around if we can fully blame teenage behavior problems on having a non-fully developed frontal lobe. They are no more prone to risky behaviors than younger children, but they do have more opportunity to engage in risky behaviors compared to younger children. A common assumption is that teens engage in risky behavior because they believe they're invincible, but research doesn't really support this idea. That's more just a pop psych thing. Oh, these teens think they're invincible. Not necessarily. While it could be the case, like I said, research does not support this idea. Next, we have attitudes toward knowledge. Another shift that happens during adolescence is how people view knowledge. Those starting college are often frustrated to find out that a lot of questions don't have black and white answers. Over the course of college education, many people move through several different positions or perspectives of knowledge. Like those mentioned here, I too was frustrated at the lack of concrete answers. Any of y'all that are psychology majors will encounter this numerous times over the course of your degree, because so much of psychology is based on theoretical concepts or abstract things like social support, culture, things like that. So there are very few concrete answers. However, I encourage you to become more comfortable with this, especially if you plan to pursue graduate school. I know for some of you it's still early, some of you are freshmen, sophomores, stuff like that. So you still have time to decide if you want to go to grad school or not, or even if you don't want to, that's totally okay too. But I struggled with this a lot, especially in my first year of graduate school. But eventually I got used to it. One thing I will say is I do encourage you to keep asking questions. If anything is fuzzy or doesn't make sense or anything like that, ask questions. However, I would shift how you ask some questions. So instead of like, well, which of these theories is better, you can ask, in which situation is theory A preferred? So for example, in which situation would you prefer Piaget's theory over Vygotsky's? That's an excellent question. There is not going to be a concrete answer to it, not really. And there probably won't be concrete answers to a lot of questions like that you might have. But it will help you get more comfortable with fluid or abstract or not concrete answers. May seem like a small step, but it could help. And it can also foster a discussion that may not have happened otherwise. Like, okay, well, you prefer this theory in this situation. Why? And if there are questions you might have about, like, what is this thing that you mentioned? What is that? You will probably get a concrete answer, because most things are defined very similarly across literature. Well, at least across psychological research. So if you ask, like, well, what's object permanence? You will get a concrete answer. Object permanence is this. But when it comes to things that are like, which theory is better, which theory is worse, like stuff like that, you're not going to get a concrete answer. Almost every time it's going to be, well, it depends. So changing the way you ask those questions can potentially help you get more knowledge about the topic. And it could also possibly increase your understanding of the topic. So just food for thought. Next, we have cognitive function in adulthood. Like everything else, there are pros and cons to getting older. A majority of aging adults complain that their memory is declining. They report not being able to remember things they used to or as well as they used to. Our ability to recall things like names of people, objects, places, etc. begins to decline after 30, which is why a lot of the times you'll notice in your grandparents, maybe even your parents, they'll call you the wrong name on accident. My mom, when she's mad at me or my brother, she goes through the whole list. She calls us each other's names. She's called my brother the dog's name. She's called me the cat's name. It happens, and it's normal. But there is variability in the rate at which memory declines. Overall processing speed also declines with age. These changes are possibly due to changes in the brain that happen with age. So age-related decline in brain volume, which is the amount of white and gray matter in the brain, as you can see here. So you have person A, person B with mild cognitive impairment, and you can just kind of see the amount of activation there, and that's what they mean by brain volume. So it's not necessarily the amount of matter, it's really just the activation of the brain. So brain volume is especially pronounced in certain brain regions, including the cortex and the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. So aging brains are also worse at taking out the trash, meaning They're worse at removing waste proteins, which can also contribute to cognitive decline. Additionally, as people get older, they are more prone to certain cognitive disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stuff like that, and that also changes brain volume. So as you can see here, the person with Alzheimer's has a lot less activation going on than the person with the quote-unquote normal brain. However, on the flip side, some cognitive functions don't decline with age and some actually improve. Even though free recall, which is recalling detailed information based on a prompt, so think essay questions on exams, declines with age, cued recall and recognition remain mostly the same. Aging adults show relatively little decline when asked to remember material that's part of their everyday life, like a daily schedule, as opposed to a random list of words that have no meaning to them. Older adults also tend to do better on vocabulary and knowledge tests than do younger adults. Crystallized intelligence, which is accumulated knowledge and experience, tends to stay relatively stable over age or improve with age. So soon after birth, infants begin to take an interest in others. They prefer looking at faces over any other visual information. As soon as 4 days after birth, infants show a preference for their mom's face over other faces. Infants also become increasingly socially engaged and interactive with others over the first 6 or 7 months. However, this doesn't last long. Infants soon develop stranger anxiety, which is a fear of strangers that develops at about 8 or 9 months old. This generally increases to about a year, year and a half, and then steadily declines. This makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Infants are more comfortable being around people they know because, in theory, those people shouldn't hurt them. Once they get to the age where they no longer have a petrifying fear of strangers, they should be able to mostly get themselves out of trouble, at least evolutionarily speaking. Oddly enough, the development of stranger anxiety seems fairly consistent across cultures, further suggesting it has an evolutionary root. Additionally, babies vary greatly in their social interaction styles, just like adults do. Some are friendly, some are whiny, some make you question why you decided to be their friend. That's a joke. These individual differences reflect temperament, which is a basic emotional state that appears early in development and is largely genetic in origin. This can be distinguished from other later appearing personality traits because it emerges early and appears to be largely genetically influenced. But there is some evidence that suggests this is also partially due to the level of maternal stress during pregnancy. So there are 3 major temperament styles that have been identified. So there's the easy babies, which is about 40%. They are adaptable and relaxed. Difficult babies, about 10%, are fussy and easily frustrated. And slow to warm up babies, about 15% or so, are disturbed by new stimuli at first, but gradually adjust to it. And temperament tends to be fairly stable across infancy. While temperament is largely influenced by genetics, can also be how the child's caretaker interacts with them. So temperament may influence how the caretaker interacts with the child, providing another example of how nature influences nurture. Based on research with cats, a 4th temperament style was observed called behavior inhibition, like the stereotypical scaredy cat. These kids are frightened by unfamiliar stimuli. This can be found in about 10% of kids. And these children are at heightened risk for shyness and anxiety disorders in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. There are also certain cultural differences in temperament. For example, Chinese American infants were considerably calmer than were European children, or European American infants. One explanation for this, was genetic differences between ethnicities, but that one isn't really given a whole lot of attention or credence. Another explanation is that there are cultural differences in practices regarding pregnant women, like exercise and diet, that could change the infant's prenatal environment. So if mom's eating better, getting more exercise, is less stressed, the kid will be more likely to be an easy baby. Right, another important process is attachment. So virtually all infants develop close emotional bonds with significant adults like their parents. This is called attachment. There might be a good evolutionary reason for this. The man, the myth, the legend, John Bowlby, seriously, he was like one of the pioneers of attachment theory, and it spawned an entire subdiscipline of psychology. Noted that it ensures that infants and children don't stray too far from their caretakers who feed and protect them. This is based on imprinting research done by Konrad Lorenz, who was observing behaviors of geese and by sheer accident discovered that goslings, baby geese, seemed to follow around the large moving object they saw after hatching. 99% of the time, this is their mom. And this is called imprinting. But what happens when Mama Goose isn't there during hatching? The goslings will imprint on the large moving object they see when hatching, even if it's not Mama Goose. They can imprint on bouncing balls, boxes on wheels, even researchers like Lorenz. Even though human babies don't imprint the way geese do, they do something similar in that they form strong bonds with those who tend to them shortly after birth. So Lorenz discovered that imprinting occurs in a critical period, and that said critical period is 36 hours after hatching, meaning that if the goslings didn't see their mom within 36 hours after hatching, they didn't imprint on her. So studies done on Romanian orphans found that something similar happened with human infants, but their sensitive period is 6 months, meaning that those adopted before they were 6 months old fared pretty well in later life, but those who were adopted later often experienced negative psychological effects like inattention, hyperactivity, difficulties in attachment, and developing new friendships. Another major contributing study was done by Harlow with his rhesus monkeys. So for a long time, psychologists believed the primary driving force behind attachment was survival. Kids would bond with those that fed and protected them. However, Harlow's semi-controversial study showed that's not always the case. And I say semi-controversial because if you Google unethical psychological studies, this one does tend to pop up. But it did have a great contribution to the field. Its ethics, I'm not really going to get into. Basically, what he found was that baby monkeys preferred the soft cloth mother, shown here in the picture, that kind of looks like a demon, even though she didn't provide food, over the wire mesh mother on the left that did provide food. Through this study, Harlow discovered contact comfort, which is positive emotions afforded by touch. This is why some of us enjoy getting hugs from people we consider important in our life, like friends, family, significant others. Attachment is typically measured using the stranger situation. Basically, an infant is brought into a room with its mother. There's a stranger there. Then mom leaves, leaving infant alone with the stranger. And their reaction determines their attachment style. So for those securely attached, which was about 60% of U.S. infants, they explore the room, but check to make sure mom is watching, return to mom. They notice mom's departure by becoming upset, but greets her return with joy. Basically, they see their mom as their safe place. For those who are insecure, avoidant attached, which is about 15 to 20% of U.S. infants, they explore the room independently without checking in with mom, are indifferent to the stranger, show no distress at mom's departure, and display little reaction when she returns. Psychologists believe this reaction to be due to the infant feeling like they can't really depend on their mom to be there when the infant needs them. For those that are insecure, anxious attached, which is also about 15 to 20%, they don't explore the toys without mom's assistance, show distress when the stranger enters, reacts to mom's departure with panic, shows mixed emotional reaction upon her return, with the mix of reaching for her but squirming to get away after mom picks them up. This is commonly called anxious ambivalent for this reason. You can tell the kid's anxious, but their reaction to mom is very ambivalent. It's not really good, it's not really bad. They're just for those disorganized attached, which is about 5 to 10% of infants, they reach for the toys, or they react to the toys, the stranger, and mom's departure and return with an inconsistent and confused set of responses. This was not included in the original classification, but later added by Mary Main and her colleagues. The main reason U.S. infants is included in each description is because there is some cultural variability in this percentage. Additionally, these attachment styles affect later behavior as well. For example, those securely attached tend to be more well-adjusted in adulthood. I even have a little picture over on the right. So those that are securely attached can trust fairly easily, attuned to emotions, can communicate. They lead with cooperative and flexible behaviors. Those that are anxious, they have a sensitive nervous system, struggles with communicating, tend to act out. One disadvantage of the stranger situation is it isn't very reliable, and in that children do change their attachment styles over brief periods in time. In general, attachment styles really only stay the same when family environment stays the same. This is one of the reasons consistency and schedules are so beneficial to kids. If one parent suddenly has a new work schedule or something like that occurs, it can affect the kid. This may not necessarily be negative. It could be positive, but it will probably affect the kid. Alrighty, parenting. So over the past 100 years, people that claim to be experts but really just snake oil salesmen have bombarded nervous parents with contradictory advice about how to be a parent. Additionally, some of this advice is contradictory to actual research findings and scientific evidence, making it worse. So, Baumrind put forth a few parenting styles based on her research done on middle-class Caucasian families. This distinction is important because, as I've beat y'all over the head with, cultural differences happen and they matter when evaluating the quality of a claim. First is the permissive parents, which are bottom left of the diagram. They tend to be more lenient with their kids, allowing them considerable freedom inside and outside the household. They use discipline very sparingly, if at all, and often shower their kids with affection. For authoritarian parents, which are the top right, they tend to be very strict with their kids, giving them little opportunity for free play or exploration, and punishing them when they don't respond appropriately to their demands. They show little affection towards their kids. As I've mentioned before, communication with your kids is preferred because strict parents raise sneaky kids. So, for authoritative, which is different from authoritarian, authoritative parents, which are in the top left of the figure, they combine the best features of both permissive and authoritarian parenting. They're supportive of their kids but set clear and firm limits. And then after Baumrind published these parenting styles, other researchers came up with a fourth. This is known as uninvolved parenting, which is the bottom right, in which parents tend to ignore their kids, pay little attention to either their positive or negative behaviors. Another kind of word for this is neglect. This is not good. Don't do this to your kids. Don't ignore your kids. That's bad. No. Additionally, psychologists have found that those with authoritative parents tend to have the best outcomes later in life, at least those who grew up in middle-class Caucasian homes. One major disadvantage to this is Baumann's findings were only correlational. However, for ethical reasons, you can't really subject a kid to a home environment that you know might be bad for them, especially if it negatively affects them later in life. Another psychologist, Hartman, believed parents should provide at least an average expectable environment for their kids. This is an environment that provides children with basic needs for affection and discipline. If parents don't meet at least this threshold, the child and their social development will probably suffer the consequences such as increased impulsivity, violent behavior, etc. Another topic covered here is non-traditional families. So these can be single-parent households, same-sex couple households, stuff like that. Basically anything that's not mom and dad. Which, this is a very hot-button argument that's been circulating since the legalization of same-sex marriage. But what about the children? Science actually finds that children raised by same-sex couples actually develop just as well as kids from heterosexual couples. They also tend to have very similar long-term outcomes, and the same can be said for kids of single-parent households. If the parent can support the family and still meet the child's needs with or without outside support, such as a grandparent, aunt or uncle, siblings, like stuff like that, as long as the kid's needs are being met, that's the important part. Because then the kid has similar outcomes to those in heterosexual household or heterosexual couple households, homosexual couple households, single parent income households, two-parent income households. As long as the kids' needs are being met, most of those kids are going to turn out pretty much the same. Next, we have the effect of divorce on kids. So popular psychology says divorce has an immense negative emotional impact on the kids. Sure, you've probably all heard the phrase, stay together for the kids. However, as I've mentioned earlier, kids are very resilient. Most research shows that most kids survive their parents' divorce with minimal negative outcomes. With that being said, some do experience negative outcomes, but more often than not, kids have minimal negative outcomes. Additionally, the effect of divorce seems to depend largely on a few factors, one of which is the severity of the conflict between the parents prior to divorce. Ironically, the kids of couples experiencing minor conflict tend to be more affected by the divorce than kids of couples with severe conflict. And part of this might be because the kids finally glad that there's peace in the household now since the parents have divorced. Parental education also plays a role. Kids with more educated moms tend to have less negative effects following a divorce, whereas those with more educated dads tend to handle it worse. Unfortunately, this part of the literature doesn't really cover same-sex couples. It's mostly because heterosexual couples are more studied, there's more information on them. However, I believe over the next couple years, probably before the next edition of this book comes out, there will be more information on this because same-sex couples and parenting are being increasingly studied more and more than they used to be. Alrighty. So the next thing we're going to cover is self-control. So a critical element of development is self-control. Kids are notoriously bad at delayed gratification, and most of them want instant gratification. Children's early capacity to delay gratification is a good predictor of later social development. Those who can delay gratification at age 4 tend to have a better ability to cope with frustration in adolescence. Additionally, we have the development of gender identity. So whatever we consider our gender to be, how we identify ourselves, male, female, trans, non-binary, is a fundamental aspect of our identity. So one important distinction to make here is the difference between gender and sex. Sex is biological, whereas gender is a social construct. Gender is how we define ourselves, not how others define us. The second year of my master's program, I taught at the experimental psychology lab. And we were talking about this distinction, and one of my students mentioned gender reveal parties. And they asked if they should actually be called sex reveal parties. The answer is yes, but people would not like that. So, just something fun to think about. Additionally, a lot of people conflate gender and sex, but they aren't always the same. Meaning that, they can be, but they don't have to be. For me, personally, my sex is female. I was assigned female at birth. I have female characteristics. And my gender is female because I identify as a female. However, that's not always true for people. With that being said, sex and gender are both different from gender roles. So gender roles are sets of behaviors that tend to be associated with either being male or female. For example, women are expected to take care of the home and the children. Men are expected to pay the bills. So for transgender individual, these are people whose gender and sex don't quite line up. The book says less than half of 1%, but I think that number is a little outdated. When it comes to a mismatch in gender identity and biological sex, the book focuses primarily on transgender individuals, most likely because a lot of psychological research has not really delved into non-binary individuals. However, this percentage is likely small as well. For those unaware, transgender individuals identify as the gender opposite of what they were assigned at birth. So trans women were assigned male at birth, but now identify as female. And something similar can be said of non-binary individuals. They were assigned a sex at birth, but they identify as neither male or female. A common misconception is that gender differences don't emerge until socializing influences like parenting practices have had the opportunity to act on children. However, some gender differences are evident even in infancy, making this explanation unlikely. As early as 1 year or less, kids prefer to play with different types of toys, even if they've been exposed to only gender-neutral toys or have had equal access to toys associated with both genders. Oddly enough, researchers have observed similarities in non-human primates as well. As early as 3 years old, boys prefer to play with other boys, girls prefer the company of other girls. And this phenomenon of gender segregation suggests that kids understand the differences between genders and are unaware that they fit better with one gender than the other. While adolescence is considered to be a stage of the most dramatic changes in the body, brain, and social activities, it's also a time of exploration and discovery. So one of the central challenges of adolescence is getting a firm grasp of our identity, the sense of who we are. Erikson developed the most comprehensive theory of how identity develops across a lifetime. In contrast with Freud, who believed identity development stopped in late childhood, Erikson came up with an 8-stage model of human development from womb to tomb. In each stage, we confront a different psychological crisis, which he defined as a dilemma concerning an individual's relations to other people. So the stages of Erikson's model, first is infancy. This is where people develop a feeling of general security, optimism, and trust in others. The second is toddlerhood. This is where people develop a sense of independence and confidence, and they take setbacks in stride. Third is early childhood. This is where people develop initiative in exploring and manipulating the environment. Fourth is middle childhood. This is where people enjoy and master development tasks of childhood in and out of school. Fifth is adolescence. This is where people achieve a stable and satisfying sense of role and direction. Sixth is young adulthood. This is where people develop the ability to maintain intimate personal relationships. Seventh is regular adulthood, or as he just called it, adulthood. This is where satisfaction of personal and familial needs are supplemented by development of interest in the welfare of others and the world in general. The eighth and last stage is aging. This is where people recognize and adjust to aging and the prospect of death with a sense of satisfaction about the future. So, in this model, in stage 5 to be specific, this is when adolescents grapple with what's maybe the most fundamental question of all, who they are. In most cases, they emerge from this crisis relatively unscathed, but if they don't, they might be at risk for later psychological conditions that involve identity. The resolution of each stage is crucial because each stage has implications for later development. If we don't resolve an earlier stage, we might have issues solving problems in the later stages. Increasingly, scientists are recognizing that many changes in identity and emotional development take place in early adulthood that are distinct from later adult experiences. Researchers define the time between 18 and 25 as emerging adulthood, which is when many aspects of emotional development, identity, and personality occur. Many in this stage struggle to figure out their identities and life goals, experimenting in an effort to see which options fit the best. This is called role experimentation. Next, we have moral development. So kids develop a sense of right and wrong fairly early, but typically don't experience moral dilemmas, situations in which there is no right or wrong answer, until adolescence or early adulthood. So there's reason to believe that the roots of our moral judgment come from fear. So in childhood, we associate right with reward, wrong with punishment, so we learn not to do bad things to avoid punishment. Piaget believed moral development is constrained by a kid's level of cognitive development. For example, children in the concrete operational stage tend to evaluate people in terms of how much harm they've done, whereas later in life, the intention is more relevant than the actual outcome. Like, did you actually try to hurt someone? Or did you hurt someone early in life versus did you try to hurt someone later in life? So Kohlberg extended Piaget's theory to identify how morality develops across a lifetime using moral dilemmas. He examined the reasoning process behind answering the moral dilemmas. He concluded that morality develops in 3 major stages. The first level he called pre-conventional morality, in which there is a focus on punishment and reward. What's right is what rewards us, and what's wrong is what we get punished for. The second level is conventional morality, in which there is a focus on societal values. So what's right is what society approves of, and what's wrong is what society disapproves of. The third level is post-conventional morality, in which there's a focus on internal moral principles that may differ from conventional societal values. What's right is what protects fundamental human rights, and what's wrong is what contradicts those rights and values. Reasonable people may disagree on what is right and wrong at each stage. He also believed that people go through stages at different rates, but go through them in the same order. Additionally, Kohlberg's research indicated that most adults never reach post-conventional morality. So, of course, there have been criticisms, like there is in every major psychological theory. While his work has been influential, it has been highly criticized. His model assumes that our moral reasoning precedes our emotional reactions to moral issues. But in some cases, our emotional reactions to morally laden stimuli, like photographs of assaults on innocent people, occur almost instantaneously. Additionally, we can know something is wrong without having to explain why. So, for example, most people know murder is wrong and typically don't have to explain why they think murder is wrong. Maybe even more problematic is the fact that scores on Kohlberg's scheme are moderately related to real-world moral behavior, and that there are low correlations between his findings and actual moral behaviors. So Kohlberg argued against this by saying his scores shouldn't correlate highly with actual moral behavior because he measures people's thinking about moral problems and their reasoning, not the actual behavior. Many people perform the same moral behavior for very different reasons. Few more criticisms are that his theory is culturally biased and sex biased. Some say it's culturally biased because Kohlberg generalizes across cultures without actually testing across cultures. Other studies have found differences between those in collectivist versus individualist cultures, but group differences don't necessarily mean a bias. What does mean a bias is generalizing to groups you haven't actually studied. Again, you guys know me, cultural psychologists, don't do that. If you're going to generalize to them, you have to test them. As for the sex bias, Gilligan believed that Kohlberg's theory favored men because they're more likely to adopt a justice perspective based on abstract principles, whereas women are more likely to adopt a caring orientation based on more concrete principles of nurturance. However, there's not really any evidence for gender differences on Kohlberg's test, so this claim may be a little unfounded. So while some aspects of our lives stabilize as we age, some change dramatically. These changes tend to be associated with major transitions in lifestyle or societal status, like shifting from student to labor force, or changing careers, having a baby, getting married, all that fun stuff. Careers, relationships, parenthood, and midlife transitions are all important changes people go through in life. One midlife transition is known as empty nest syndrome, which is when parents experience emotional distress after their kids no longer live at home. So, defining age is complicated. When people think age, they typically think chronological age. How many years have you been on the planet? However, as we've seen in this chapter, there's a lot more to aging than simply getting older. There are 4 more ages. There's psychological, functional, social, and biological. So biological age is an estimate of a person's age in terms of biological functioning, like how efficiently their organ systems function. Psychological age is a person's mental attitudes and agility and capacity to deal with stresses of an ever-changing environment. Some people display little change in memory, ability to learn, and personality from adolescence to old age, whereas others deteriorate substantially. And then we have functional age, which is a person's ability to function in given roles in society. Functional age may provide a better basis for judging readiness to retire, replacing the arbitrary criterion of chronological age. So while someone may be 65 years old, their functional age could still be in their 50s, and they're still good to work, and they still are good to be part of the workforce. Lastly, we have social age. So this is if people behave in accord with social behaviors deemed appropriate for their age. For example, I'm sure we've all heard someone claim a woman is dressing too young for her age, or have heard someone say a man is behaving like a child, and that would be social age. Right, just a couple quick housekeeping things. So quizzes for chapter 6, 8, 10, and 11 are due Saturday, March 27th, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. And exam 2 is due Sunday, March 28th, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Also, make sure you're getting your SONA done. That's super important. Don't want to get an incomplete, so make sure you're getting those done.